Tutorials are the gateway into an adventure. They guide a player in their understanding of the game's language before letting them spread their wings and explore on their own. Breath of the Wild has one of the most beautiful intros in gaming's recent history, rivaling the likes of Northern Undead Asylum of Dark Souls and the intro of Mega Man X. I do believe Breath of the Wild being especially refreshing is partially a result from how Zelda tutorials were getting longer and more tiresome. I specifically remember Spirit Tracks and Skyward Sword being incredibly long-winded, at the start having to teach you multiple different mechanics slowly before just letting you explore the world, in stark contrast to the NES Zeldas, which just let you play. But a good question to ask is actually, where do the Zelda tutorials end? So I had to define them for the games below, which are usually considered as when you have most of Link's standard equipment and mechanics and you are free to go to the first temple. Zelda 1 literally starts as you go into the cave and pick up the sword. Zelda 2, there isn't a tutorial. You don't even collect a sword, you just can waltz to the first temple. A Link to the Past. While you get the sword and can do Hyrule Castle, I believe the game properly opens up when you bring Zelda to the Sanctuary. Link's Awakening. Grabbing the sword on the beach. Ocarina of Time. Kokiri Forest until the Great Deku Tree. Majora's Mask. I would consider that when you can leave Clock Town after the first 3-day cycle. Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons are both when you talk to the Maku Tree after receiving your sword and shield. Wind Waker. This one was interesting because maybe Outset Island, maybe after Forsaken Fortress, but I would say it's after Windfall Island when you can sail on the King of Red Lions. Minish Cap, I consider that when you speak to Eslo and can actually turn into a Minish. Twilight Princess, it's when you change back from a wolf. Phantom Hourglass, I would say, is when you finished your first run of the Temple of the Ocean King and you get access to Linebeck's ship. Spirit Tracks, similarly, is when you do your first run of the tower and then you get access to the train. Skyward Sword, when you go to the surface and speak to Impa. Link Between Worlds is when you speak to Zelda and you can finally get items from Ravio. Breath of the Wild would be the entire plateau, and Tears of the Kingdom would be the Great Sky Island. And for each of these games I recorded times based on 4 criteria. When you pick up a sword, when the tutorial was finished, when you reach the first dungeon, and, the most important stat of all, when you touch grass. So, with all that in mind, I've made a graph of how long it takes to complete each tutorial in each game. And you see, this is trending upwards. But, because it is quite volatile, it might be better to break it down by the 3 types of Zelda games. Top-down, 3D, and open air. This does show a nice trend. We have seen that top-down Zelda games have slowly been adding more and more of a tutorial, peaking at Spirit Tracks, which by the time Link had received the train, 1 hour, 39 minutes and 18 seconds had elapsed. Clearly, Spirit Tracks and Skyward Sword having very long tutorials was a message Nintendo received, as this was quite heavily countered with Link Between Worlds at 27 minutes exactly. And then, even more interestingly, Breath of the Wild leaving the plateau at 1 hour, 26 minutes and 52 seconds. Undeniably, a game with far more mechanics and things that need to be explained, but streamlined the learning process in such a way that it's actually quicker than Spirit Tracks. My 2 favourite Zelda games are Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time, and they really have quite quick tutorials. You have story and the world explained to you, and then you grab the sword very quickly. 2 minutes and 6 seconds for Link to the Past, and 6 minutes and 24 seconds for Ocarina of Time. While you finish your tutorial in 13 minutes 59 seconds, with a further 9 minutes before you reach your first dungeon in A Link to the Past. But it is Ocarina of Time that is astounding, that Kokiri Forest and entering the Deku Tree is done within 12 minutes and 45 seconds. I love the speed at which you are thrust into the adventure, and the trust the devs have with you here. Certainly as Nintendo has gone on in time, instead of literally dumping you into the game with zero direction asking you to just figure it out, they have been far more friendly to new players, trying to spoon feed them information, so nothing is missed. But this does unfortunately mean the player waits far too long before they get to have that vertical slice of what the gameplay will be like. You should have the sword shortly, as that is integral to the gameplay being the entire combat. But it isn't just the speed at which Breath of the Wild lets you engage with the mechanics, it's the fact that most of the gameplay itself is what I would define as free. I would classify there are 4 types of gameplay in a tutorial. Talking, where you're just mashing A and letting the dialogue continue. Walking, which is just guided walking or gameplay where you have to move between A to B, where most of the section is locked off and you don't have many choices. Cutscenes, different from talking in that mashing A doesn't actually make it go quicker. And finally, gameplay. You have a sword, you can explore, you can do lots of things, you can do mini-games, you can do all sorts of things. The games Skyward Sword, Link Between Worlds and Minish Cap are really bad for this here. You spend over 70% being forced to listen or follow. Skyward Sword is at 80.05% forced gameplay. 47% of it is talking to NPCs, 26% of it is walking between places where you don't have a choice, and 8% of the game is cutscenes. And considering the tutorial is over 2 hours long for Skyward Sword, that's a lot of time spent not playing the game. You compare this to Breath of the Wild, where 76.53% of the gameplay is free. You have 3 cutscenes, one at the start, one at the end of the plateau, and one when you activate the Sheikah Tower, for 13.4% of the entire tutorial. You speak a tiny bit to the old man and Zelda for 7.9% of it, and you have the forced walking from the Resurrection Shrine to the Vista for roughly 2.2%. Essentially, everything after the tower emerging is free gameplay. You can do most of what you can do in the full gameplay here, which is wonderful for just letting the player experience the game and learn themselves. I stick Spirit Tracks into this graph as another good comparison to these games where you spend so much of the time not playing the game. While it does look like a lot of Ocarina of Time's gameplay isn't free, you must realise that it's an 1/8 of the length of Spirit Tracks. So the Navi cutscene at the beginning and speaking to the Great Deku Tree account for a big proportion of the cutscene and talking percentage. Link to the Past just lets you play once you're in Hyrule Castle. You get the sword from your uncle and bang, you're away. It's going to be infinitely better letting the player explore and learn the mechanics on their own, if it's designed well enough. Another thing I looked at was reaching the first dungeon after the tutorial, and it is fairly interesting. Early on, you're just thrown into it fairly quickly. Kokiri Forest literally ends where you begin the first temple in the Great Deku Tree. But games like Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword are different for 3D games, where you can enjoy more of the world building. For example, in Majora's Mask, you don't just leave Clocktown and get to the first temple, you actually have to discover the temple first, in which you understand the Deku shrubs and the local animals' plight and the poison of the swamp, and understand that this area is in need of saving. Wind Waker, you have to climb Dragon Roost after sailing there, finding out the plight of the Rito tribe and Valoo in agony. So this makes it when you beat those temples, you have solved the problem for that area and you've helped the people, which gives you more of an idea that you are being a hero. Twilight Princess makes you explore Faron Woods to get to the Forest Temple, and similarly Skyward Sword does the same before reaching the Sky View Temple. But these two are more go get the MacGuffins, as opposed to help the surrounding area. This graph also shows that how the open air games are very much encouraging freedom, so it takes a long while to explore and find the temples. You probably could get straight there about as quick as the other 3D games, but that's knowing where to go and heading there, instead of the non-linear exploration which is very much emphasised. Now of course, the most important graph, touching grass. In Skyward Sword and Tears of the Kingdom, you spend the start of the game either underground or inside a house, so it's not easy for you to touch grass. Okay, but for real, here's a better graph. This shows when Link first can move, as in you don't have to talk or listen to cutscenes, where you are free to control and play as Link. And you see a clear trend which encapsulates most of Nintendo's philosophy. The story and hand-holding slowly increase the amount of time you spend before you actually move as Link, with a tiny dip with the Oracle games. It reaches its peak with Skyward Sword and Spirit Tracks with over 10 minutes before you even move, before changing its philosophy and trusting the player to learn from gameplay, closer to how the original Zelda games were designed, and you see that sharp decline down to Link Between Worlds, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom. I do believe future Zelda games, Nintendo will not deviate from this methodology. They have said they have no intention of stopping making these open-air games, so fully expect a Zelda where you're given the freedom to explore within minutes again. Giving the player the ability to discover for themselves and trusting them is the core for the very essence of adventure. And another thing that makes video games so fun. So I can only have hope that the series is going in the right direction going forward.